Hello, and welcome to Suite 212, putting the arts in their social, cultural, political, and historical contexts, here on Resonance 104.4 FM, still London's best and brightest radio station after more than 2 decades on the air. I'm your host, Juliet Jakes, introducing this fourth series of Suite 212, launched here on Resonance back in July 2017, and only now getting onto a subject that I've wanted to cover all along: the state of poetry and poetry presses in 21st century Britain, in the wake of Brexit and the pandemic, the age of austerity, and more widely. We're still not back in the Resonance 104.4 FM studio, which is perhaps for the best, as I'm a little ill today, as you may be able to hear, although fortunately not with the dreaded COVID-19. At least that's not what the test says. But anyway, joining me via the safe distance of Zoom are two of my favourite contemporary poets working in the UK, Ed Luca and Nat Rahar. So Ed Luca is a poet and writer based in London. He runs the poetry events platform and radio show Rivet. His work has recently appeared in Spam magazine, Erotoplasty, Poetry magazine, 3am and others. His first full-length book of poems, Heavy Waters, was released on the 87 Press in 2019. His newest collection, Other Life, was published this year on Broken Sleep Books, and he can sometimes be found of an evening playing Seven Aside, either with or against me as fate dictates. Nat Rahar is a poet and activist scholar based in Edinburgh, Scotland. She is the author of 3 collections of poetry, of Sirens, Body and Fault Lines, published by Boiler House Press in 2018, Counter Sonnets with Contraband Books in 2013, and Octet, Vir Books in 2010. Her creative and critical writing has appeared in South Atlantic Quarterly, Map Magazine, Transgender Studies Quarterly, We Want It All, an anthology of radical trans poetics, published by Nightboat in 2020, the On Care anthology, published by Mar Bibliotech in 2020, the New Feminist Literary Studies, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and Transgender Marxism, published by Pluto Press in 2021. Nat co-edited Imagining Queer Europe Then and Now, a special issue of Third Text Journal in January 2021, and is the co-curator of Life Support, Forms of Care in Art and Activism exhibition at Glasgow Women's Library, which is currently running there until the 16th of October. She also co-edits Radical Trans Feminism zine. So Ed and Nat, welcome to Suite 212.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you both so much for joining me today. You know, I've been friends with both of you and fans of your work for some time. So I'd like you both to, introduce yourself and your work to the audience now. You've both picked at least one poem of yours and maybe something else as well to introduce you and your work and maybe who influenced you. So Ed, maybe we'll turn to you first. If you'd like to explain what you're going to read to us and then read it.
Great. So shall I start with my own poem? Yeah, so I wanted to read a poem for the theme. So because today we're talking about poetry within the context of Britain and politics and austerity, I guess I chose a poem from my book, Other Life, where I was kind of thinking through, in some way, the relationship between the kind of self-elected radical and the kind of more kind of pervasive radicalism of everyday life as it sits outside of the kind of self-elected radical. So it's called Song for No One in Particular, and I think the poem itself it has an argument within it, so I don't want to explain what it's trying to do. I'm just going to let it do it. Song for No One in Particular. I am starting from the question, are the intellectuals the enemy of some possibility of commonness against their best wishes? How do you get them to throw down, pulled away from the pit of thought's production into the dance? Heal yourself and move, or move to break yourself, the same proposition. And what some commons means is, oh, You are stoic in the face of isolation, and loneliness is not universal, but constituted by its diffusion, marking the spaces between. The temporary breakout which you felt as the tonal rupture, but we stand on our word together, with the word being the communion, and there is lack where we look for it, as the lines move to demarcate loss, getting thrown around like a dance. Joy to stand against the lack there is, which we incessantly will to find, mastering the pen for our soft-fingered prisons. That's how it works out. So many falsehoods to try on, where the dress-up is always disregarded as surface play. Yet how do you get to wear down this life of the wronged round the best way back to the way out from which you start from? Distinction and our common touch, both abraded by the stolen life. Wishing to sequester yourself behind all those books, we rack our knuckles on your door and ask you to get down. So that poem was probably written kind of 4 or 5 years ago. And I see it as kind of, it was written in a sequence of poems where I suppose, in a kind of like transitionary period in my thinking about like the power of poetry and poetry's relation to like not only politics generally, but just kind of being in a person inhabiting a world. And I suppose before that, most of my poetry was often a kind of playful exploration of some kind of like negative or abrasive relation to the world of experience and social life within our society, you know, like our deeply unjust society, often kind of using humor and playfulness to kind of think through the kind of like most damaging and kind of pained experiences of living like a life in a society ruled by commodities at the expense of people. And I still believe all of that stuff, and I still write poems that kind of reflect that kind of playful negative relation to those pain experiences. But I became increasingly interested in trying to find like joyful or like common or shared experiences I guess one of the ways I was thinking about this earlier is it's a common tension in the thinking of people interested in radical politics, which is like almost like the methodology of critical theory versus history from below, like, and they're constantly in tension with one another, which is not to say that those are kind of direct kind of correlates for the way that those arguments get played out in poetry, because I don't think that poetry does theory, but yeah, it's a kind of tension in my work between different forms or ways of being adequate to the world, which is probably mostly about different kinds of emotional resonances, from humor, like kind of quite scathing humor, to kind of joyous and emotive bursts of exaggerated or excited feeling. And like, yeah, I've been thinking about this kind of recently, and I suppose at heart, like I increasingly feel like a kind of romanticist with poetry in a Keatsian way.
Interesting, thank you. I'd like to obviously return to a lot of things you've said there, but I'd like to obviously introduce Nat to our listeners now. So Nat, if you could just tell us a bit about which work you'd like to read, and then share it with us, and then tell us a bit about why you chose that.
Yeah, of course. Hi. Thanks for that also, Ed. There's already loads of really nice thoughts on the table. I'm going to start by reading 9 very short poems that are all 9 lines long. So it's this contemporary form called the Niner. It's invented by Mendoza, the poet Mendoza, who I'll be mentioning, I'm sure. And I think it's kind of like, it's part of a sequence I've been writing for about 4 years, coming up to 4 years, of 81 poems. And I kind of began writing the sequence the week that the kind of trans healthcare collective I was part of were getting dragged through the right-wing press in a bad way. And yeah, it touches also, I think, along a lot of things aesthetically that I'm sure we'll get into further. But I'm just going to read. So how about that flaming global order, conjugation of our revolting looks, mouths and passions, your horror that we could bloom, scripting lashes in digital from your genes, impure, be light collectivize means to body, urgency scored to futures, revoking your vocabulary. In the attempt to establish norms, all guard keep the country moving with contagion, herds, excess and slaughter, new floodplains, we dole hounds, surface ruptures, reorient senses, skills, radical imaginary, belief in chaotic possible. We live fabricating this. And in each extra minute, inhabiting toxicity, sure, capitals youth poisoned, denigrate oxygen and particulates, logic of what years have been stolen from us, our faster conservative deaths, decayed, barren and suckered, tattered palms, sanitized. As all the exits shut, reverse the town hall, each riot van engine removed, chassis neo-marine ecology, sensate vessels history, bitter buried sounds, ride it up the walk, seam before tarmac. Babe, hold. Frequencies to be removed from the air. More. Dependent cages unwritten, stretch verbs revised, bonded, victors, capital, etc. Fly no flags as evaporate currency, stone. Know this hand. Your devious logics, neo-occupation of words, sentiment, bare grammar of bodies, tangential, trained, maneuvered. Left little of what nutrition, hazel kernel, cocoa dusk, right relation, reveal hands in depths, pleasure, brown, somatic, thawed out, turn up soil, in spirit, accrued ancestral, known, re-woke in the day's longest, say it. Feel music in your eyes, rain, and the hardest truths. And girl, who are you to abandon the beautiful? Jettison ways of being, pursed on edge, on song, speed, surf, ace, divine, tuned, luxurious, the earliest known sensations adorned, silk woven, learning your rhythm from canvas, lubrication for your soil. Oh, tragic national consensus, tearing continental flows, classify, evidence, carbon, date, pulled up medieval bones. And all inspirited life, we will exercise your explorations from all land, ocean, all your orders and abstractions. The disappeared will live. Justice is a demand to unfold, reverse the future. Turn the truth up from soil, in the everyday compelled, all that crashes with pandemic, all that's held against need. And after our affections, dozed regressive history, bloom alternate truths. Okay, so it's the poems. They're from a sequence called Apparitions or 9 by 9. Part of the reason I chose to read them, or that they've kind of been hanging, is because, yeah, when I started writing this sequence, it was a real like return to old influences. And I think in particular, Sean Bonney's The Commons, which was a book that came out in 2011 by the London poet Sean Bonney. Sean is a close friend of mine and Ed's, and passed away in at the end of 2019, just before the pandemic kind of began. And I think just like Sean's been such a key poet for understanding both not only just for political poetry, but for like our personal understandings of like how the world's been unfolding and the politics of it in the past, like I guess the past 10 years. I remember I can remember what I was doing the day that I spoke to Sean, on the day that David Cameron came into power. It was made promised it, you know, that kind of thing. And just also in terms of this, like, it's also about the situation of like what my relationship was to poetry, because when I first started going to poetry readings in London in like 2009, when my friends were I was going with friends to readings, Sean was kind of working through this sequence and was experimenting also with playing with musicians, and you know, the work was inhabiting these different kind of spaces, like the kind of upstairs pub rooms that the London poetry is kind of seen as often inhabited, but also like galleries, some gallery spaces, also like some occupied spaces, like some squats and things. And that became like, I guess, like a map of like where poetry could live and where poetry did live, and what it sounded like and what it could do and what it could tell you about the way things are or were or could be. And that's like why, that's I guess why it felt important, why poetry became important or felt important, and for one reason, at least the political reasons. And yeah, and that the Commons was is ultimately a sequence of sonnets. It's like about these contemporary experimentations in form that are also taking place and were very present in London, and also like, you know, heavily influenced what I was doing. Yeah, sorry, I'm like, there's lots of clipping. So yeah, so that's partly why, and it's also just because it's like this work that's unfolding, and I'm still trying to figure out. I'm nearly at the end of it. I'm trying to figure out what my relationship is to this work. Some of it I literally just wrote last night, and so yeah, and it's also just trying to understand like just that thing that sometimes poetry knows more about the world than we do, or I think as poets, like there are sometimes you stumble into something in a poem which you're like, oh, that's an idea. That explains something, or speaks to something that's happening or has taken place, or the way that something comes together in life. And that's I guess the why experimentation is important for me, or why I find it important, or why I find it important in other people's writing too. Yeah.
Great. I mean, there's something I'd like to ask both of you about influences. And this springs from the fact that all three of us have spent time at the University of Sussex. Indeed, Nat, you and I graduated from our PhDs on the same day in January 2020. And I think all of us came into the orbit, at least, of Keston Sutherland, who was a very interesting, even very politicized, very linguistically sort of exuberant poet, and delivers his spoken word performances with sort of extraordinary zest and energy. Keston himself was obviously influenced by J.H. Prynne, Jeremy Prynne, who I met through Keston once or twice, and Ed, I know you've written on extensively. So Ed, maybe you'd like to come in first and just talk a little bit. We've got a few minutes here about the sort of influence of that circle of poets on your work.
Yeah, of course. So I did my undergraduate at Sussex back in 2005 to 2008, and I arrived in Brighton as a teenage anarchist and left as a well-versed Marxist kind of and that was Keston. I was taught by Keston for many courses in my second and third year, and he's still a good friend, and he was hugely influential on many of us at Sussex at that time in getting us to write poetry, both as a poet and a scholar. And yeah, his influence on that point in my life was profound, and I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, he not only did he get me interested in like the weirdest poetry I'd ever come across. I remember him introducing us to lots and lots of poets, and I had an interest in kind of strange noise music and free jazz at that age already. You know, 2005, 18-year-olds in Brighton, you know, like everyone's listening to the weirdest stuff. But yeah, I mean, and Keston liked that music too, but yeah, his relationship to poetry was very much like that. Like, oh, you like this Peter Bruitzmann LP? Why not read this Stuart Calton pamphlet? Or, I mean, you know, not that it worked exactly like that, but he was very generous. And yeah, he got me interested in writing poetry and taking it seriously and thinking that that was something really worthwhile. Yeah, but not only him, many other people at Sussex too. There was a very strong culture, and there still is a strong poetry culture in Brighton. And then Prynne, I wrote my PhD on Prynne's relationship to American poetic modernism, specifically Ezra Pound and Charles Olson, two huge kind of figures in poetry, and put a lot of energy into that in a way that I'm really glad that I did, but I'm not. It helped me learn a lot. Maybe I think Prynne is a very important poem, but his biggest influence on me has perhaps been as a reader of poems, and I have a lot of complicated thoughts about his poetry that maybe would be for another time to expound on. But I'm again hugely grateful for his influence, especially as a reader. I think he's one of the best readers of poetry.
Yeah, it's hard not to turn it into a really personal story, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess my relationship to Sussex and to Keston Sutherland, and we're also going to talk about institutions, I guess, in this context, is that, you know, I kind of like stumbled into poetry, and maybe this is me continuing from the last section, through, I guess, in particular meeting other writers in London, often other trans and queer non-binary writers who now identify as non-binary as well, but at that time were trans, queer, genderqueer writers, in particular poet Mendoza. And we were like, you know, it was this thing with my relationship to writing was kind of primarily through music, and to kind of shift to like a focus on word and the page and what that means or whatever, and also performance and reading of texts, was kind of heavily just influenced through this, like going to readings in London, like as many readings as we could go to that were happening, finding out who these poets were, what they were about, what their aesthetics were like, what their poems were about. And yeah, so I remember going to see Keston Sutherland read at a night called Open End, which took place at the Foundry, that Steve Willey and Alex Davies used to co-organise. And yeah, just I think, did I see Keston read? Anyway, just something along those lines. I'm just say Open End. But long story short, basically, I was the really kind of pivotal point for me as a writer is that I got invited to read at the Sound Eye Festival of the Arts, which was a festival that took place in Cork for about 20 years. It wrapped up in 2017. And it was very closely allied to, it was a poetry festival, and there was kind of like art, film, music or sound kind of taking place in that same context. So it felt very like organic. It felt like a space that made sense to me. In terms of what I cared about. And I think I was just like, I just want to commit my life to poetry. So, and Keston had read at that festival, and so had some other people from Sussex, including Sarah Krangle. And I was just like, I'm going to go do masters, because my undergrad was in the sciences. Like, I don't have a literary background from that sense. So and it kind of made sense for me to go and study at Sussex, because it was like, I was interested in the theory. I also studied philosophy, like when I was younger. And I was really interested in the theory, and I was like, I could get in on a writing program with my portfolio, but I can't get into an English degree with my credentials. So Sussex was this, like, I was described it as like a creative writing degree, a critical theory degree in disguise as a creative writing degree. So that's what I signed up for, and it really worked out. I was studying also like post 1950, like American writing, like in the lineage of Olson, Charles Olson, who as mentioned already. And yeah, just like that became a really important place. But it was also not the only place that I was getting my like literary / aesthetic education from. And this is during the student movement as well, right? It's 2010, so like every week things were unfolding in the world, and we were like understanding what was happening, and Sussex became this like microcosm of neoliberal management and stuff, and we were trying to understand all those things. So it was like, on the one hand, it's the education and sure being in the institution, but on the other was like understanding what was happening and the kind of political education we were getting, both through our relation to that institution and also like through what was happening on the streets in London and the student movement in 2010, 2011, that period. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all really interesting on the sort of background at Sussex in the sort of 2000s through to the turn of the decade. I'd like to maybe bring the discussion slightly closer to the contemporary now, and I've got some notes about questions around how poetry can be politically useful, and that's sort of simultaneously a very big question and perhaps also a slightly trite sounding one. So I think it might be interesting to make it a bit more specific. Ed, you have picked out recently that there's a chapter on poetry in Lola Olufemi's recent book for Pluto Press, Feminism Interrupted, which sort of uses poetry to illustrate the power of imagination in political thinking. Often think of sort of some of the power of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in the 2017 general election. I think was drawn from sort of quoting from sort of popular poetry, but and sort of poetry you might be taught at school. But Olufemi's range of interests are very contemporary and they're quite wide ranging. So I wonder if you'd maybe like to tell us a little bit about that as a way into this topic.
Yeah, I think so. Basically, we spoke before this meeting about how the poetry scenes or poetry worlds in England and Scotland have changed in the last decade. And Nat and I kind of came up with a generation of an entrenched kind of opposition between experimental and mainstream poetry, where some of those boundaries have shifted a bit, but partly because of changes in publishing and the internet and access, but also I think because younger poets are less invested in that binary. And Lola Olufemi's Feminism Interrupted she's a really smart young scholar, and it's a great book which kind of, from a younger person's perspective, looks back on recent histories of activism, radical politics, and feminist organizing in the UK. And she has this whole chapter called Arts for Art's Sake, where she basically, having spoken about these very kind of recent histories in terms of organizing and feminist principles and activism, she really saves this space for saying art, and especially poetry, have a specific purpose or function in relation to politics. And it's not about being agitprop, but being a resource or a space in which the imagination can grow and flourish without any kind of express or direct need for a political purpose or function which might produce it. So like art for art's sake, in some sense, as a kind of, almost like a kind of spiritual way. And it was very interesting to me that this book was published by Pluto. It's probably sold pretty well. And the poets that she's drawing on are like Wendy Trevino, Jackie Wang, Anne Boyer, and they're all poets that I love and care about for their work very deeply. And I just think it shows a kind of making space for the power of poetry as a set of processes, a set of experimentations, and a mode of play that is kind of outside of the everyday rules of life, and how that's radical and how that's involved in liberatory politics and abolitionist politics. And I think it marks a kind of sea change in the space that poetry is given. And I just kind of hope too that like the writers living in this country who have liberatory and abolitionist politics can get as much attention as Jackie Wang and Anne Boyer and Wendy Trevino, because there's many poets in this country that do. And I'd love to see them as well read as Lola Olufemi is too.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the health of poetry in the culture in terms of the position of poetry. Sorry to use health as a metaphor, but the position of poetry within contemporary radical, leftist, feminist culture, anti-racist, cultural production as a whole. That on the one hand, poetry feels relevant, and its political relevance is not questionable in a way. And in the past, I would have to like defend that really strongly, but now I can just be like, no. And I think this says a lot about this relationship between, on the one hand, like an abolitionist politics, on the other, the role poetry plays in all of our lives as people who are like poets, but we're also like public intellectual critics or whatever. And that these things, like on the one hand, like study, and I don't necessarily just mean that in a formal institutional sense. I mean like study as in like you care about the world, you care about what's going on, you're studying it, you're reading some books, maybe you're having conversations. That study and poetry are kind of interlinked, and yeah, it's really exciting. You know that there are. I think Lola's a very good example of like up and coming scholars who are also writers, who are also inhabiting this public intellectual space, who are taking up some space. You know, Lola's co-curating the Revolution is Not a One-Time Event series that's currently happening through Somerset House, right? In this month, in September. Is it Thursdays? Somebody correct this, please. Tuesdays, Thursdays. Sorry, I haven't got my diary together.
As a resident of Somerset House Studios, I should know, but I don't.
Yeah. Anyway, so check it out. That's happening. Revolution is Not a One-Time Event, and that like this relationship of like, you know, poetry is really key in this political culture. In this, specifically, if we're talking about abolition and we're talking about social transformation in the world we want to see. Yeah, I think that's, and Ed's right. There are loads of great, really great writers in the UK and in Europe, elsewhere, making this work and making similar work. There's something about the question about publishing, maybe we can talk about that later, that is about like, you know, why certain writers have emerged and I do think it is also like maybe a publisher's interest in North America over what's happening in the UK, both in terms of poetry, like I'm talking about UK publishers as well, like poetry and also political thought, but maybe that will change. But you know, it's all good. And yeah, I don't know what I can add.
Okay, well, I'd like to just come in there just to remind listeners that you're listening to Suite 212 here on Resonance 104.4 FM. I'm your host, Juliet Jakes, and today I'm talking to Ed Luca and Nat Rahar about the state of poetry and its relationship to politics in 21st century Britain. So that's an interesting point you just raised there, both of you, and Nat, especially about this sort of transatlanticism and the role of publishers, and the way, like you say, a lot of publishers are focusing on North American work. It definitely feels to me like there's been a sort of cultural and contextual shift, because I think back to the early to mid 2000s when I was in the orbit of these poets of Sussex who I mentioned. And, you know, they were doing formally and politically very interesting work, but it didn't really feel to me that they maybe had the kind of reach that they do now. I think some of those same poets have a lot more reach now, I think, and that's partly because certain types of political cultures have emerged due to, you know, socioeconomic shifts since the mid 2000s that have maybe given them a bigger political infrastructure to plug their work into. I don't know if there's anything to be said about the internet and how poetry as a form is well suited or not to being shared online, and you know whether that can lead to works reaching audiences that you might not necessarily have expected. But I think I'm coming back to that question of sort of the divide between bigger and smaller poetry presses and what they're publishing, and I wondered if there's much more to say about that at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the internet always comes up, and yeah, the internet's also evolved so much in the period you're talking about, from the start of the 21st century into where we are now, 2021, on Zoom. And the poetry's also like, so there's the two things. So on the one hand, like, you know, it's that thing like poetry's the cheapest art form. You just need a pen and a moment. You know, you don't even need a lot of time. You just need a moment. Or a phone. You know, I used to write exclusively on my phone. And the internet is also like, the internet is free, or can be free to a degree. It's not always free. But you know, the me and Ed both came up in this time where like all the poets had a blog. You know, I'd be reading like Sophie Robinson, Sean Bonney, all of their poems on their blogs, like whilst I was at my minimum wage job, slacking off, right? That's been so, and that's 10 years ago. So like moving on now, it's like obviously there's a whole thing about the Instagram poets. Somaya wrote a really good essay on this a couple of years back. This in Poetry Wales, about like how Instagram is functioning, is its role. We could talk about that as well, but like I think there's so that on the one hand, the internet is an alternative, is a space. It's a space that feels democratic, even though it's kind of not. You know, we all know it's not. And simultaneously, publishing remains relevant because books have a different reach. And I can just give an example. Like a couple of weeks ago, I went to Lighthouse Books, which is like the independent bookshop in Edinburgh, and I bought a copy of, and it's like a selected June Jordan and an Audre Lorde book republished by Penguin. I'm just like, what is this world that I can just go into my like, you know, indie bookshop and find a book of June Jordan? And it's just like, you know, for the last 5 years, like the only way you get a copy of June Jordan is like out through one of the poetry libraries. You know, there's only like 2 or 3 in the whole country, and then you have to give it back. You know, long live libraries. But that's interesting because on the one hand, you know, again, it's like this republishing of like really essential, and we're talking like specifically like Black, women of color, feminist writers, from the last 50 years, who were based in North America and Turtle Island, and like it's great that they're here and we can read them. You know, anyone can go into a bookshop and buy a book of Audre Lorde these days. It's great. And yeah, it's something about how all these audiences come together and what publishing is doing. And you know, there are some controversies around this as well. Like there's been a whole recent controversy about the translations of Norbessa Phillips' Zong into Italian. Norbessa's been writing about it on Facebook. I definitely suggest you go and have a read of what she's been saying. So publishing isn't also totally neutral, especially when we're talking about living poets. But it is good that writers who like the contemporary writers, especially if we're talking about, you know, like not just decolonizing, but like challenging the canon, like dismantling the canon. And it does feel like there's a big space, isn't there? There's a big space, which is the like, where are the interesting contemporary writers coming up from Europe now? And I think a lot of us are still publishing with indie presses, independent presses, or small presses, just because, you know, basically big presses care about sales, and we're not in poetry for the money. You know, like there's no, you know, poets don't make money, and yeah. And so but then there's some interesting presses like Ignite who've been doing some really interesting stuff in terms of their kind of model and what they're doing and how that's come together. And that's also, you know, the people who've established Ignite have also been working in publishing before. Yeah. And it does feel like there are a few books that are sneaking out. Like I'm thinking about Jay Bernard's Surge, you know, that is one, and it on the other hand, like it's good when people do get published by majors because the work is available. And yeah, I just want to see more like interesting, like Black and brown and POC and queer and trans, like and you know, disabled and crip and mad writing coming out from those presses. But yeah, how that will happen or not, we'll see. But yeah.
Yeah, loads to kind of follow on from that. And I think Nat kind of summarizes some of the changes or tendencies quite well. There's like a really healthy, flourishing small press culture at the moment. I'm really impressed by the amount of work coming out from younger poets. And they're really invested in maintaining histories as well. Like I love what Spam Magazine are doing. I love what Tom Crompton and Dom Hale are doing. Luke Roberts is Distance No Object, publishing a lot of good pamphlets. And with that, and there's many other people too. But with that kind of small press culture, there's since the kind of demise of the kind of independent bookshops slightly, there's problems with distribution, and loads of those poets publishing in small presses have the freedom to kind of work on their practice and create more kind of create more freely. There's no editor with sales demands telling them how to write, so you get this much more organic practice. But a lot of that work, it's just like 100 people are reading it because there's 100 copies available. And I wish that work was more available. And as Nat says, if you have J. Bernard Surge on Chatto and Windus, suddenly thousands of people can read it, and that's great because that's a really brilliant book. And Jay did loads of research in the State Watch archives at Mayday Rooms to write that book, and it's a serious book.
And George Padmore Institute as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, can we I think it'd be just interesting to just unpack J. Bernard Surge a bit and what it's about.
Yeah, of course. I was also going to say we should also do explain what small press is. So maybe I'll do both of those. So small press, the idea of small press is it's basically like zine culture, but in literature. In short, anyone can start a press. You basically need access to a printer and some word processing skills. And small presses vary massively from like people producing 30 pamphlet under a label to like people producing, a couple of hundred, maybe even up to like 500,000 print runs of a book. And small presses, it's the turnover is literally, as the name suggests, small. It's not really about the money. It's more about getting the work out there. And the distribution is massively varies, and it's mostly about like how much people want to do. But a lot of small presses are either at